So this was the original question. How might we teach voice and/or movement courses virtually? And with what I was just saying in mind, it seems like in order to consider that question, we should first ask ourselves why we teach voice and movement in the context of actor training. And a few things that we came up with are these following things: the awareness of a student's instrument, the ability to practice a discipline to develop healthy habits, and also increasing the capacity of a student's instrument beyond recognizable human behavior. So what does that mean? That means that we focus on things like breath awareness, centers of gravity, kinesthetic response, and spatial awareness. That we are looking for ways to create sustainable actors who can do 8 shows a week and who can meet the demands of style, whether that means style through heightened language or singing, advanced styles of movement and dance, stage combat and intimacy training, or any kind of character development that extends beyond reality. Another way to say that is to meet the demands of the text, whatever that means, whether it's a written text or it's just the intrinsic demands of a style. So with that in mind, and thinking about how these classes might be different from a regular acting class, Matt introduced me to these terms of daily and extra daily, which I will let him explain.
Great, thank you so much, Tom. So as we were kind of thinking about these practices and we were working on Zoom or thinking about HyFlex or hybrid or socially distant education, we were talking about voice and movement training and the exercises or experiences within those trainings that either live in a daily or pedestrian world or an extra daily or expressive or heightened instance so that we can better understand what things work well on Zoom, socially distant, or in a hybrid model. So Tom, if you could do a little click. Thank you. So these are some examples of things that we were exploring living in a daily or an extra daily place in our voice and movement trainings. And these extra daily and daily experiences vary from the teaching environment. So the example on here of topography might feel like an extra daily experience if we're confined to the Zoom screen. Yes, our students can explore in their rooms a small bit of topography, but if they're really going to understand that practice, we usually look at that in the studio. What things can be done sitting in front of a screen in a daily experience: breath awareness, balance, alignment, in the world of movement, kinesthetic response is we were thinking about exploring on a screen, behavior, shape, things that can be done in front of a screen. And as I said before, these things will shift and change or slide from column to column depending on the learning environment. Yeah, Tom?
So with that in mind, I think that as we were talking and Matt was showing me a Suzuki form and how to maybe teach that via Zoom, we started having a conversation about when thinking about pivoting or translating any kind of lesson. For us, we believe the most important thing to consider is how does that come from your practice, from your expertise, and from your best teaching? Because there may come a point where it seems unrecognizable. And when you're looking for a resource or a how-to or somebody else did it this way, that takes you out of your practice and in some ways unseats you as the expert in the room, which can feel like a very uncomfortable thing. So there's some questions to think about. Do you identify as a generalist or a specialist? So I identify as a generalist. So in some ways, it makes it easier for me to imagine different ways to teach things because I'm not deeply trained in Fitzmaurice or Linklater or Lesak. I like to move between them. So with that in mind and where you stand, how can you easily imagine how to translate your teaching practice online? And if it seems like a challenge, what are those barriers? And Matt's going to take this question.
And how does it fit into your school, department, or circumstances? As we've all been in rooms this past week with the environment completely changing and shifting, do you have the necessary tools and resources to translate a lesson? When I was talking to Tom about that exercise in Suzuki, most of my movement training is either Suzuki or viewpoints. As I talk about outcomes and the things that I need to teach in that class that is called Suzuki movement, how do I achieve those outcomes? And if I can't, who do I go to? What other trainings can I pull from that I don't have expertise in? Which is interesting. And that just speaks to the fact that I don't have complete autonomy over the class that I teach. I'm handed the course title, I'm handed the outcomes that I need to achieve. And other folks experience a freer, more, a class in which they have more autonomy. And it depends on your curriculum as well. In a conservatory style for your program, what outcomes do you need to do, complete? What part of the industry are you training your students to explore? Or is it an elective course? Do you have an opportunity to shift to a more survey style course that a lot of the resources that we see coming out are leaning towards? So yeah.
Yeah, I keep talking about the something else, not just in our meetings, but in a lot of other meetings. And at Vassar, all of the faculty have the liberty to create a something else without the fear or restrictions of a prescriptive curriculum. And I realized the luxury that that might be from my current perspective. So when thinking about different circumstances, we were looking for areas of focus that seemed universal, and we came up with the following, which is just a first take. What does it mean to consider space as it relates to bodies, behavior, and other spaces? What does it mean to set up the home studio for yourself and for your students so it doesn't have to be your bathroom all the time? And also, what does it mean to consider body, right? Is the thing that you're considering an internal exercise for internal awareness? Is it external, whether that means for that one student or as they relate to the space and other students? This next one's yours, Matt.
And then we have behavior, internal, external, and how it relates to other bodies in space, thinking a little bit about those extra daily and daily experiences that we were talking about before, which we'll come back to in a little bit. And then the last one, time on task. How much work are we asking our students to do, either in a synchronous studio or asynchronously, and how much work are we giving ourselves in those mediums as well? Yeah.
So we started thinking about what it might look like to create a tool to help any instructor consider a specific exercise, project, assignment, or lesson. So when thinking about my practice and the way that I like to teach and learn, I'm a very visual learner. So being in a space where I can't use a bunch of Post-it notes right now is hard for me. But what we did do is I've been using this online tool called MindMeister, which is the mind map tool. And I'm going to walk you through a little bit of this flow chart that we made that could possibly be useful as we think about what we're doing. So don't panic when you see what this whole thing looks like. I'm going to walk you through from the beginning. Oops, pardon me. So, yes, broadcast. The question is, how can I teach this voice under movement exercise virtually? First question, do my students have the space to experience this lesson in the way I usually teach it? Yes, they all have soundproof mansions. Great, carry on. Some do and some don't. So what are some follow-up questions to that? Yes and no, there are circumstances that make it difficult for them to use their whole instrument as they would in the studio. We'll follow that one first. Do these circumstances create a safe physical space for the student? Yes, it's not about physical safety. If the answer is no, then you probably shouldn't teach that exercise virtually. Are these circumstances about considering others in home situations? Yes, this can be solved can this be solved in an asynchronous way? Great, rock on in your own time. No, are there other one-on-one strategies you can help develop with the student? And then yes or no. And then just following briefly the other way that same question goes. Some do and some don't. Can you plan an optional modification? Yes, sit, stand, lay down, your call. No, is there another exercise that isn't as space dependent? that achieves the same things? Yes, put that exercise through this chart, or no, get help. And I think we're going to be talking about that get help a little bit later. And then just to review, these were the other categories we had: bodies, what kind of behavior is it asking? And then one that we've been talking about a lot, what kind of time does this exercise take? Do we have time in class for the virtual version of this exercise? And what does that mean? And that it could be a balance of synchronous and asynchronous, depending on the exercise. So here, this is what the whole thing looks like. It's a little intimidating, but there's a link to the whole thing. And I think whether or not you find this useful for your practice, the act of doing it really helped me, and I believe it helped Matt consider our practice and what those questions are. So it's really more of a question finding expedition than an answer giving. And finally, these were just some other resources because we didn't want to not provide any resources about recommendations. The first one are recommendations for reopening school theater programs during COVID. A colleague of mine shared this Peabody Institute, Johns Hopkins Return to Campus Guide specifically for music. There is this really great German study, which is the third resource here, which recommends, I think, 12 feet of distance. And then lastly, the VASTA scenario planning guidelines. The link at the bottom is a link to the folder that has not only the slideshow, but all of these in it. Great, I know that there's a lot of chat going on, so I'm just gonna see. Cool. So I think that's what we made, and I'll put a link to that folder in the chat in a hot second, but I want to hand it over to Matt, who's just going to bring us into the conversation part of all this.
So we did want to fly through that pretty quickly because we wanted to acknowledge the fact that this conversation has drastically changed in the past week. Following the ICE announcement that international students are going to be forced to leave the country if schools go online, we've been having conversations with a lot of teachers whose schools have last minute decided to move off the online mode and into high flex or in-person teaching so that they can accommodate those international students. So as more and more folks are trying to figure out how to do their teaching in person, we thought we'd focus on tools, and that's why we created that flowchart. How can we put any exercise or any activity that we do in our classroom through that module or through a similar module that you create based on your own practice, and find modifications for students who do have to study from home based on COVID infection or a possible COVID infection, or how do you address that in a social distance environment as well. So this morning, after Tom and I had that conversation yesterday, I was working through some of my Suzuki work and how I might use that question of space in a socially distant environment. And it still worked. It's not ideal, it's not perfect yet. It is our two brains sitting down and asking questions of each other for about a week now. But that's where we're leaning because we don't have the choice now. A lot of faculty are finding. So what tools or resources can we create, or methods of modifying, and if we can't modify, create a network of outreach to the Michael Chekhov friend who might know how to work on low center of gravity when your student can't stomp in their apartment building. And that's kind of where we left it, and we wanted to leave time for conversation as we all have touched base. I'm trying to remember faces and where you all are and how you will be teaching in the fall. But leave it up for conversation and additions and queries, qualms. So